Good evening from Beijing. My name is Eric Bergloff. I'm the chief economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session tonight and to be back at the LSE, at least virtually. So we're going to be talking about what we call development finance architecture. This is really how we can make the different institutions, the multilateral institutions, work in an individual country and work with the stakeholders and under the leadership of the host government. We'll do so based on a book by Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister of International Cooperation of Egypt. The book is called Stakeholder Engagement Through Economic Diplomacy. And it's a book that really outlines all the different elements of this cooperation and how to make it work better, how to reach higher standards, how to bring together different interests and make them work for the country, and to do so in a complementary way and efficient way. We are absolutely delighted, and I will say a bit more about Dr. Rania later on. And we are absolutely delighted to have with us also Carmen Reinhardt, the chief economist of the World Bank and vice president, and also Minouche Shafik, the director of the London School of Economics. I'll say more about them later on. But first of all, I wanted to give Dr. Rania a chance to say a few things and maybe introduce the book that is being launched today. The book is part of a series that we call the Policy Reform in the Making, and it's an opportunity for leading policymakers, particularly from the emerging and developing world, to reflect on policy reform and introduce that to students and to faculty at LSE, and of course much more widely. But that was the origin of this. It's been part of an initiative called the Mariam Forum, where started at the LSE to bring together faculty and students on the global issues and working with policymakers and students and academics from the emerging world. And we are absolutely delighted to have Dr. Rania here. The event is hosted by the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at the LSE. The Firoz Lalji Institute promotes independent academic research and teaching, open and issue-oriented debate, and evidence-based policymaking. The Institute connects social sciences disciplines and works in partnership with Africa to bring African voices to global debates. In terms of format, as I said, I would first let Dr. Rania speak, and I think she has a presentation, and then we'll go to the different interventions. We also have a number of videos that we will show during the discussion from different people who couldn't be here in person, but who wanted to say something on the topic that Dr. Rania's book is looking at. So, Rania, the floor is yours. You are muted, Rania.
Hosting us on this platform.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be launching this from the LSE platform. Stakeholder engagement through economic diplomacy is actually very timely. And the way I would like to structure my talk is go over the global context in 2020, what motivated us to push this through, explain the principles of economic diplomacy, which are 3: multi-stakeholder platforms, mapping official development assistance to the UN SDGs, and also global partnerships narrative, and then I will conclude. Of course, given that I'm very happy Minouche is with us, Carmen Reinhardt is with us, IFIs are represented. So here we have the academic community, we have the international IFIs as well. So it's really the spirit of stakeholder engagement. Let me just very briefly, of course, all of us were hit in 2020 by the pandemic. We know that in 2015, the world came together to decide on 17 SDGs. It was sort of a common denominator for all countries when it comes to the different development goals. When the pandemic hit us, every country was sort of in this challenge. Would the 2030 agenda be derailed? But then what was extremely important was multilateralism and international cooperation pushing the development goals forward. And that's where the function of economic diplomacy, emphasizing international cooperation as one of the main sources of financing for development. Principles of economic diplomacy, this is not new in the literature. There are actually many theories in the literature, but sort of, you know, given my academic background, but also being able to, or wanting to operationalize the different theories. If we take a look at the literature, we find that economic diplomacy comes in the context of, you know, thinking about the political economy of development cooperation, thinking about the interconnections among economic, social, and political interests of the active roles of different stakeholders. And finally, also economic diplomacy, as identified in the literature, sort of focuses on the articulation and advocacy of the different stakeholders and how countries can actually cross borders through more engagement with the world. So this was sort of the theoretical background. What I wanted to do during 2020, and of course, in the pandemic, there was a silver lining. How can we actually engage with the world? So here, sustainable development is only attainable through collective integrated efforts of the different national and international stakeholders. Also, as a Ministry of International Cooperation, we're the national entity that develops and strengthens cooperation with our development partners. And finally, economic diplomacy framework is one that can push the frontiers of multilateralism, and that is by strengthening inclusive and impactful engagement with governments, other governments, development partners, policymakers, and the private sector. So just to you know, summarize the three principles, and again, what we tried to do over this past 18 months is to try and change the mindset around international development cooperation, international development financing through these three principles: multi-stakeholder platforms where we all come together to make tangible change. Then we have ODA SDG mapping, which we're going to spend some time explaining the theoretical background, the implementation, and where we go from here. And this is extremely important because the only way to have efficient plans towards SDGs is if we know the impact that we have so far. And then finally, creating a clear and transparent communication framework with all our stakeholders. So these are the three principles. Let me again just say, why is this important for us as a country? And this is also important for other countries. I just take Egypt as an example, but this can be definitely replicated into other country cases. If we look at within this framework, which is you know, a country-led exercise, we try to maximize socioeconomic returns from ODA. We try to ensure the alignment of development interventions from our development partners with the national objectives that we have, and also with the global objectives, which are the SDGs. And then finally, and very important, we try to enhance the management of development cooperation for better implementation of development projects within the country. So these are extremely important objectives for the framework of economic diplomacy. Now, let me go over principle one. And for each of the principles, I'll very briefly explain where we come in terms of theory, and when we operationalize it, how did we implement it? Of course, we cannot think about multilateralism without immediately the United Nations coming to mind. And when we take a look at the different writings from the UN, here I just take a quote by the UN General Secretary, where he speaks about the importance of robust partnerships to basically create that knowledge sharing to be able to meet the SDGs. Again, a very important call by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, and Eric with us today was one of the eminent persons who actually called for effective country platforms to maximize contributions of development partners. Not only that, but also try and create a platform for the private sector to actually contribute to the development story in different countries. So this was sort of the context of multi-stakeholder platforms. For us in 2020, there was a silver lining. We could not meet with all our partners physically, so it was an opportunity to engage with the world virtually, but this was extremely important in creating an institutionalized, transparent, and inclusive country-led framework. Here we identified our stakeholders: government, development partners, private sector, civil society. We had very specific objectives: transparency, inclusivity, alignment, complementarity. There were models of engagement, and there were different levels, be it national, regional, or international. When we take a look at, again, the different phases, and we go in the book over what these different phases entail. Initially, we have the inception, initiation. We have the design of the multi-stakeholder platform, actualization of different partnerships based on what happens during the engagement, review, and then scaling. In our case, we did the inception, the design, and actually there was actualization of different partnerships. In the period ahead, there will be the elements of review and the element of scaling. During 2020, there were several MSPs that took place, and we go over them in the book as well, with the different interventions that took place. Moreover, continued with several of those, but the key element or the key objective was private sector engagement. And let me say that as we were designing the MSPs, the OECD has its Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which is a survey that different countries engage in. And we announced those results, and there were certain recommendations that we took into account. Some of them were more engagement with our stakeholders, including the private sector, and these were some of the items that we kept in mind as well. Another important element is the role of the private sector when it comes to development finance. And this was, again, in the light of what the different international institutions, OECD on the top of those, and we have with us George from OECD, the head of CDC, where basically the idea is that a private sector is able to create more value in the development process. Therefore, there needs to be mobilization of private finance from development partners, development finance institutions, or multilateral development institutions. Today, the world is talking about blended finance. So there is a scope to be able to reach to that sort of modality through the platforms, through discussions, through this inclusive dialogue that takes place. And then finally, impact investment and social impact investment is today something that we hear a lot. And that's because all firms want to not just be behind profit, but also purpose. And therefore, it's for every country, while it is putting its case for investments or for more inflow into the development process, it needs to create a compelling story. Again, other institutions that call for stakeholder engagement through private sector is the World Economic Forum, and we have our colleagues from the World Economic Forum with us as well. Egypt was one of the signatories on that, and we also explain what that means in the book. Now comes an important part, which is how we align the development finance to the SDG, establishing a link between ODA and SDG. And this is extremely important because it creates the interventions across different projects in the country. And I will be sharing with you the different exercises or the different analytical options for this type of mapping. So from the literature, the mapping has, or the reason why we do the mapping is to create greater accountability. And that is because every dollar that happens in terms of partnerships with the international or with the world really how much of it addresses certain goals, what are the results, also the direction of future interventions, and then how we communicate change that takes place, and then finally, what are the learnings that we come out with and the evidence in order to create more effective interventions in the future. So if we take a look at the methodology and approach, and this is a very important exercise that we carry out as Egypt, and it is completely country-led, and we did it in coordination with our development partners to align the objectives and the results of ODA with the different SDGs. There's the sector SDG mapping, sectoral SDG mapping, and then there's the project SDG mapping, and there are two methodologies, the single and the multiple. And in the book, we go through each of the 17 SDGs doing these exercises. We have the full portfolio across the full spectrum of projects, ODA projects. And basically, if we take a look at the first methodology, the sectoral mapping results, and each of these methodologies has both pros but also limitations. And this is what we explain in the book to basically create a guidance for future work, and also it could be replicated by other countries. So if we take a look at the sectoral mapping, basically what happens is each sector within the country requires certain financing. So this is a straightforward exercise. It just creates an understanding of where the ODA has gone on a sector level. It gives information, but there is limitation. It falls short of providing sufficient evidence on the non-sectoral interventions. So for instance, if we're talking about sustainable cities and communities, that might be with one national entity. However, there are other entities that might be benefiting from this intervention. If we go to the second approach, which is project mapping, you go a little bit, you go a little bit deeper, project by project, and then if you go through a project exercise, you are able to identify more than one SDG that that is met through this type of exercise. There's of course value in this because you get a financial implication, you get a dollar value with the SDG. However, the limitation is that it does not capture cross-cutting themes such as poverty alleviation, such as gender equality. So this is one of the caveats that exists, but as I mentioned, it creates the financial value for the different SDGs. So if we take our full portfolio, we see that the highest three SDGs are 7, 9, and 6, the number of projects and the allocation. But if we want to take a look at the cross-cutting themes, we have to go through the project multiple mapping results. It's very different. And here we give just one example in the presentation, but the book has the 17 SDGs. So here, for instance, if I'm looking at SDG number 1, no poverty, this is, and because poverty is multidimensional, it has different linkages with different SDGs. So what happens here is the no poverty is in the middle. If you are doing a wastewater management plant, it does have an effect on poverty. If you're doing schools and spending on education, it does affect poverty. So here, the size of the squares shows the financial allocation. The thickness of the line shows the number of times the relevant SDG was mentioned when we talk about poverty. So this provides very detailed information about the linkages between the SDG, the one that we're focusing on, and then how it affects or how it is affected by projects that could address it. Let me give an example. If we take SDG number 5, which is gender equality, if I do a single mapping, we're only talking about 3 partners, and we're talking about 2 key sectors, financed through 13 projects. However, the single mapping does not provide information on, or does not really reflect how gender is an objective. Gender equality is a very important national objective, and it's also a key objective for all our development partners. If we take it to the multiple mapping, we find that the number of partners increase, the dollar value of these projects also go up, and the number of sectors that actually reflect more gender equality or work towards gender equality are much more. So this contrasts the difference between single and multiple mapping. And as I mentioned, the book goes through the 17 SDGs. So there's a lot of value in doing the full mapping exercise. Now, if we put everything together, and this is also, we go over details of this within. If you do an ODA finance project for all the projects, here you see that there's the relationships are very complex, reciprocated, and again, the thickness of the lines shows how many times the different SDGs are interrelated. The size shows again, and these are just for the Egyptian portfolio, but if we take other country cases, the same exercise can be replied. Now, sometimes there's a lot of questions on how we onboard the private sector. Is the private sector also able to contribute to the SDG agenda? So with IFC, we carried out a mapping exercise for the private sector allocations, and we were able also to identify how they contributed to the different SDGs. Principle 3, and with Principle 3, the whole concept of communication today is extremely important. There's nothing that is not communicated. Sometimes international development cooperation and international and development finance is one of the heavy topics to communicate, but it's extremely important. And that's why strategic communication in this area is of absolute importance. It creates advocacy with the constituencies. It also creates a consistent narration with all stakeholders and with the development partners. So again, if we're thinking about why we are communicating or what are the tools, there are traditional tools which are becoming less effective. The technology plays a very big role, and we know that during the pandemic, people started to follow very much digitally. And so through very targeted communication, you can create impact. There are various channels that the book also goes through to the audience. And all of this is very important because you want to be able to create an understanding of what is happening and also motivate future interventions when it comes to development finance. The design elements of different modes and this is something that we have done in the ministry. We look at the geographical meaning. So there's a spatial way of explaining or communicating development finance. Also linguistically, using certain terms to reflect on the constituencies. Then using different models. There's the visual is very, very important. And then there's the gestural way, the behavior of how you present the development story. So just to conclude, and I went very fast through the different elements, but the global partnerships narrative, the consistent line that we used with everyone is that each and every development project actually has people at the core. These projects are projects in action, and the purpose is the driver, and the purpose is really the 17 SDGs, depending on which project we're talking about and depending on the mapping. So the multi-stakeholder platforms create the alignment and create the complementarity with our stakeholders. ODA SDG mapping identify the results to a large extent of the interventions and guides for future interventions. And then the global partnerships narrative is basically how we are able to tell the story in a consistent way. So what we aim to do in this book is to provide an opportunity to capture and document a country practice, in this case, Egypt, where there are findings and insights of how stakeholders can actually come together. And then we have future interventions that would be more targeted. And basically through all of this, the ultimate aim is to be able to achieve the 2030 agenda. Maybe just in conclusion, and I take this platform as an opportunity to launch our the map on the website. So in the spirit of transparency, everyone can go on the website now and basically see the different, the map itself. This is the map of Egypt, the different SDGs. If I take SDG number 3, which is good health, you can take a look at the different projects. Oops. I think, okay, let me. Maybe I can go back to this at the end of the presentation. But basically, on the website itself, there is a list of the different projects, the mapping to the SDGs themselves. Okay, here we go again. There we go. Okay, and if we take number 3, which is the good health. Yeah. So these are the projects, the full portfolio. And then universal health insurance is one of the projects we're doing with the World Bank. So it shows the main objective, related objectives, where they are in the different parts of Egypt. If we take another one, water is extremely important. So if we look at water sanitation, we take an example, Bahr al-Baqar, which is one of the very important projects, one of the biggest in the Middle East. That's a single goal, and then the related goals. Also, the different, you can actually go through this by partner, by SDG, by governor. So this is, again, a very important tool. This is renewable energy. We have one of the important wind farm projects. So this was just to illustrate that what we did theoretically in terms of mapping, we were able to implement on a country case, and there is a lot of value for different countries to do this as well, because each one of us contributing to SDGs nationally actually adds to the global agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. This is a very impressive performance. Thank you. So the topic is, of course, extremely important, and it is in each country really where the whole global system comes together, and it's the global players, the regional players, the national players, the national development finance institutions, the private sector, the civil society institution, and so on. They all have to come, and some of your images show the complexity and of course the many objectives through the sustainable development goals. And bringing all this together is not a small task. It's something that is now very much at the top of the agenda for the Italian G20 presidency. And I was in a meeting the other night where the Egyptian example of the multi-stakeholder platform was actually emphasized by the World Bank when they gave examples of successful country platforms. So it is extremely important project, and something that we have a lot to learn from the Egyptian experience. So thank you very much for that presentation. We have someone here who comes from the World Bank, Carmen Reinhardt. She is, as I said before, the Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. She was previously at Harvard, where she's on leave from her position as the Minos Zombanakis Professor at the Kennedy School. She was before that at the University of Maryland. She's one of the most cited economists. She has written widely on international finance and macroeconomics, and she's particularly known for her work on the financial crisis, both in advanced economies and emerging markets. It's a great pleasure for us to have you here, Carmen. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to say, it's a great pleasure, especially also Rania was a former student. So our connection goes very, very far back. I'd like to take the opportunity to commend her for what I think is really outstanding effort, work to bring together, as you mentioned, Eric, it's very timely, and I will talk a little more about the timeliness of it. And we hope really it becomes a template for other countries as well to adopt. So let me say that first, I'll say a little bit on why this is so important now. And I want to touch on 3 issues that Rania focused on, on ownership, on accountability, and on transparency. And so in the setting is particularly important because we all know the COVID pandemic has generated global financial strains, especially in emerging markets. It's an extremely regressive pandemic, and it has led to significant financing needs, very large financing gaps, pretty much across the board in varying degrees, but pretty much across the board. So the allocation of finance, the allocation of competing demands is very much it's always been a topic. It's an increasingly important topic going forward. I would add to that the significant financing needs from public and private sector are also at a time in which, and Rania mentioned this is also how these things map to various goals. Well, most of those goals have suffered significant setbacks during the pandemic, ranging from educational programs to gender equality and so on. So the framework of accountability of funding is particularly timely and important when you have large needs, scarce resources, and big setbacks in goals. So to reiterate, it couldn't be more timely. On the issue of ownership, perhaps let me work backwards. Let me focus on the transparency. One of the big attractive, which is, as I said, I hope this becomes a template of this work, is it is a major step in the direction of transparency, greater transparency. This is also, Eric, you mentioned the initiative of the G20. There is hardly a G7 or a G20 meeting where the issue of transparency doesn't come up again and again. Now, I have to caveat, of course, money is fungible. So I think, the issue that we can always apportion things and allocate things, very tidily is subject to a lot of caveats. But I think transparency and accountability are something that, whether it's private fund managers looking where to invest, or multilaterals and bilateral creditors assessing the impacts of their lending, accountability is and transparency are recognized as to be of increasing importance in the context of the World Bank, there is a major drive, for example, on increasing transparency on financial accounts, fiscal accounts, debt, and so on. This, this contribution by Rania is an important step in that direction. Let me say a couple of words. I know we're running tighter on time, on the issue of ownership. And again, this connects to timeliness. I started out by mentioning the legacy of the pandemic, the setback to goals, the large financing needs. Well, looking ahead, these are precisely the kinds of times where difficult actions are part of the resolution of the process. Governments, whether it's implementing new energy policies or the need to reshape the budget, the need to do post-pandemic belt tightening in an environment in which there are still dire needs, is ripe for social discontent. And this is where the issue of ownership is so important. Bringing in all the stakeholders, importantly also reaching the issue of communication, reaching to the broad audience, for also not just creditors and multilaterals and the international community, but the domestic community. Because without ownership, what we know of IMF programs and many other structural reforms is that many will be doomed to fail. So the issue of through accountability, through transparency, in showing what governments can deliver or are delivering on the various development goals, I think one can make an outreach into that ownership, because without ownership, these are very difficult times in which to engage in significant policy changes. I will conclude with the nowadays one cannot really have almost any discussion without bringing in the environment into the main focus, and Rania, of course, listed it as one of the areas that are part of the goals. I think when we're looking at outreach to the global community, there is a new momentum for development finance that is building the whole area of green bonds, the greater wave of consciousness of the environmental issue. So again, going back to the issue of the timing of this book, I think it is very important to recognize that reaching out to that new potential public-private international creditor base is also, I think, something that, again, I hope this becomes a template for other countries' approaches as well. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And I think what you emphasized with ownership, I think is so central. And I actually think this is a very good example of where a country takes ownership over this process and make sure that all the difficult choices that have to be made have to be owned by the countries, and they have to take responsibility ultimately for these choices, of course, and that's why ownership is so important. We have the other commentator today is our own, or the LSE's own, Dame Minouche Shafik, who also comes to this with a very long background, working for the IMF, working for the World Bank, working for the Bank of England, having been in charge of a DFID, or the former DFID, the development agency in the United Kingdom. Minouche, you bring a lot to this question. Please, can you give us a few wise words here? Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm not sure they'll be wise, but I will do my best. Thank you very much for asking me to participate, and congratulations, Rania, on this very important work. I was going to make just 3 remarks: one on efficiency, one on effectiveness, and one on the multi-stakeholder issue. On efficiency, I guess I've been around in the development business now for a long time, so I can remember the history of thinking around donor coordination, harmonization, and multi-stakeholder work. And, when I was at DFID, the big thing was the Paris harmonization agenda and how do we get donors to coordinate among themselves. And then when I was at the World Bank about 20 years ago, the big thing was what was called then the comprehensive development framework. I don't know if any of you remember that particular piece of development jargon, where there was an attempt to do a mapping like has been proposed here, but not nearly so comprehensive or transparent. But again, it was a little bit about donors coordinating themselves. And I think what's distinctive about the work that Rania has presented is that it is being done by the country for its own development purposes, and mapping donors into its framework and its objective. And it is a good manifestation of real ownership and being led by a country for its own strategy. So it's just good to remind ourselves how far we have come in the discussion around multi-stakeholder partnerships and economic diplomacy. I think the second point I think I'd make is that the mapping exercise is incredibly useful for aid effectiveness. I mean, there are still huge perceptions out there that aid money is wasted, that multilateral development banks aren't effective, that government spending is wasteful. And this mapping is key, not just for showing the efficiency of resource use, but also its effectiveness. Because when you do the mapping, you can see where the gaps are, which SDGs are not being met, which parts of the country are not being served. And in many ways, identifying those gaps is the most important thing. One of the things about the SDGs is that we know that, for example, SDGs that are based on measuring inputs, like how many kids you get into school, are much easier to deliver than SDGs that are defined as delivering outcomes, like reduced maternal mortality or improvements in literacy and educational outcomes. And the mapping that's been presented here is a way into that question of effectiveness and development effectiveness, and enables one to identify where we're falling short and where we need to do more work. We've done, actually, funnily enough, a similar exercise at the London School of Economics and mapped LSE's own research against the SDGs to see where we're falling short and which areas of research have been relatively neglected and where we need to do more. So it is a really good discipline to make sure that we are being comprehensive in our approach. And then finally, I think this approach really brings home the idea that no problem can be solved by one actor. And governments can't do it alone, the private sector can't do it alone, civil society can't do it alone, the multilaterals can't do it alone. And we've known that for a long time, and people have paid lip service to that for a long time, but we haven't really had a way to operationalize that and make that real. This recent pandemic brought this home so clearly. countries didn't necessarily have the resources, or in many cases, the supply of vaccines and PPE to respond. Multilaterals might have been able to provide loans, but if the supply of materials wasn't there, the loans couldn't be used effectively. The private sector didn't necessarily have the supply chains it needed to deliver at pace. And so unless you brought those parties together regularly, there was no hope of making progress on the crisis. And increasingly, I think we have to see most of the big international challenges as ones that can only be solved by that sort of variable geometry of multilateralism. And finding mechanisms to make that variable geometry work is really difficult. And I think what we've seen here today is a really good example of how a really useful tool for making the complex geometry of international cooperation actually practical and effective and efficient. And so a very useful model for other countries to adopt, and hopefully one that contributes to Egypt's own development more effectively.
Thank you very much, Minouche. And now we have a chance to bring in questions from the audience. But first, there are a few interventions from people who you are going to bring in, Koyo. So Koyo is working in the background to bring in, I think, Richard Atias, Yelena Panova, and Jorge de Silva. Can we?
Yes, hello.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, very nice to be. I don't know if you hear me.
Yes, we hear you well.
Excellent, thank you. So I would like first, if you allow me, to congratulate Her Excellency Dr. Rania. I think I would try to bring modestly a different contribution to these two important topics which are linked in the book of Her Excellency, the stakeholders engagement and the economic diplomacy. With what I'm doing for a living for almost 30 years is to bring people together and to see how we can help nations, governments, corporations to build their influence. And what we noticed, and what I noticed for the past, I would say 18 months, is that the stakeholders, whoever they are, they have their own goals and objectives more than ever. And even Your Excellency, Dr. Rania, I saw your great slide where all the stakeholders' demography. And I would like to add one, which was maybe missing or part of this group, but I want to make it more obvious, the media, because the media are also a very important stakeholder. And I think we should not, and we cannot forget them or ignore them. So the stakeholders, they have their own goals and objectives. They have also, and they're making very important decisions that may affect our organization. They have lives that may be affected by our organization decisions. And they are also financially or even physically better or worse off when things change. So I think it's important to take all these points in consideration. And when we have this observation, so how do we connect them with this notion of economic diplomacy? Economic diplomacy is definitely today one of the major tools of diplomacy. And just few examples. When in Egypt, to go back to the country of Her Excellency, when the president was elected, His Excellency President Sisi, the first initiative he took was to bring the world to Sharm el-Sheikh. And it was called Egypt the Future. And I was very privileged to be part of this organization. And after 3 days, the country raised almost $50 billion of commitment for the following 10 years. And this is where the Egypt new capital was even launched. This was an answer to the stakeholders' needs, because we were looking for new jobs, we were looking for new dreams, we were looking for new opportunities, we were looking for public-private partnership, we were looking for more global engagement. Yesterday, just yesterday in Versailles, in France, President Macron brought 200 global CEOs to do what? To sell France as a destination to invest. Again, it was a combination of economic diplomacy and an answer to many stakeholders' expectation, including, forgive me to be a little bit cynical, including the voters who will vote for the presidential election in a few months from now. So it's important to show them that the president is leading a strong economic diplomacy to support foreign direct investment. The 13th of July in your country, in United Kingdom, I would say where the headquarters of the London School of Economics is, which I admire a lot, and I would like to congratulate Minouche again for the terrific job that she's doing. Boris Johnson will host another economic conference with some friends and to develop again a partnership about, and we can continue what Saudi Arabia will do end of October, what the President Putin did in June at the St. Petersburg summit. And last but not least, the most advanced country in the world in terms of economic diplomacy is China. They are all today in Africa, we are talking about Africa, with every year almost a $50 billion commitment to invest in Africa. One point I would like to raise on economic diplomacy and stakeholders' expectation. Everyone wants to be politically correct today. This is why we need to take in consideration ESG, SDGs, corporate social responsibility, because all wants to invest for good and everything we do has to do for good. My last point to summarize is that today more than ever, what is important for stakeholders and for economic diplomacy is precisely because now the world is starting to recover, to reopen, to rebuild. We see this neo-renaissance. It's important and it's time to rethink the importance of trust. At no time has it been more tested or more valued in our leaders and each other. Trust is a basis for connection, and trust is physical, trust is emotional, trust is digital, trust is financial, trust is ethical, and I think it's very important that we keep that in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Richard Ucharacias is the former executive producer of the World Economic Forum and the chairman of Richard Achias and Associates. So thank you very much for that intervention. The next one is Yelena Panu.
Eric, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. The Minister of International Cooperation, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, for the launch of the new book. For the United Nations system in Egypt, this is extremely proud moment due to two reasons. First, several UN entities are actively involved and also recognized in the multi-stakeholder partnerships mentioned in the book. And also, secondly, the book and the economic diplomacy advocated by the book puts the sustainable development goals at the center of development cooperation. So if you allow me, I would like to also share with you how the book is of relevance to the UN system and also to the development partners group, development partners operating in Egypt in particular. So firstly, the book makes a pioneering effort, indeed, in improving the transparency, and the previous speaker spoke about this, of financing flows by mapping the ODA spending with the SDGs. For example, the book, if you look at it, shows that SDGs 7, 9, and 6 combined receive almost 65% of the total ODA portfolio in Egypt. And this information we didn't have before. So this data should then motivate all of us, development workers on the ground, on discussing how we can work together to augment financing flows to some of the SDGs that currently we see at the bottom of the list. Secondly, in my view, in our all of you, the book provides evidence of interlinked nature of the SDGs, and Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, demonstrated this in her presentation from a practitioner's perspective. Because very often we, especially we at the UN, convey to the stakeholders at a conceptual level that SDGs are highly interlinked. But the book translates this conceptual notion of interlinkages into a practical level using a practitioner lens. Very, very valuable contribution. It shows how the ODA finance project targets certain primary SDGs while also recognizing the linkages to other related goals and targets. And this is a very useful information because it helps us take a stock of which of the SDG interlinkages are recognized at the project implementation level, and at the same time identify the linkages that are perhaps not adequately harnessed currently in the ODA projects. And thirdly, the book proposes an actionable framework for coordinating official development assistance and also implementing the SDGs. The multi-stakeholder platform model, which was described in the book, is a tested, successful model, already tested, of realizing this whole of society approach, which is required to realize the SDGs. And the MSPs that the Ministry of International Cooperation, under the leadership of the Minister Al-Mashat, launched in 2020 and continued this year on themes including health, gender, MSMEs, e-finance, digitalization, etc. All this, this effort exhibits an agile governance structure for development cooperation that promotes transparency, but also accountability, as also highlighted, I think, by Dr. Reinhardt. And it also opens the way for more enhanced partnerships, ultimately benefiting, of course, the people of this country. So let me conclude by congratulating once again Her Excellency the Minister for this book, which will be an invaluable resource to the development community. And I want to also, say at the end that we at the UN family look forward to building on and also implementing the catalytic principles of economic diplomacy advocated in the book. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Panova, who is the UN resident coordinator in Egypt. And of course, the UN is a very important part of these multi-stakeholder platform or country platforms. Very important to have their leadership in these platforms. We have now, it seems like the third speaker is not here. So I wanted to go to take a question from the audience. So can I take from Uwe Gehlen? He's saying he's very positive to these efforts to put feedback and to bring together people and on these platforms, and he thinks that Egypt have had a particularly strong effort. Maybe you can say something, Dr. Rania, about how specifically did you go about bringing the parties to the table? What was it that allowed you to bring everyone together? What were the tools that you had at your disposal? I mean, we know that many of these institutions want to act on their own. They want to showcase their own contributions and so on. How did you work?
Thank you very much, Eric. And let me just start by thanking Carmen, my previous professor, for her interventions, and Minouche, definitely. And I have also comments on some of the points that were made. But just to reply to the question, there was a silver lining in the pandemic, because everybody wanted to contribute to help get out of where we were stuck. We could not travel, we could not meet in missions. So the multi-stakeholder platform was a very effective tool to collectively sit around the table, everybody complementing each other. And the whole point, as Carmen mentioned very correctly, financing is you know, a rare commodity these days, and everybody wants to make sure that the interventions are pinpointed, are effective, and you know, there's a bankable project that you can actually put your money on the table and achieve. So I feel that because the country has a very strong history over the past 6 years of designing projects, implementing them, and delivering, this was a very important starting point. The initial condition was extremely supportive to be able to build on top of that and have the stakeholders around the table. When Richard mentioned the media as one of the stakeholders, that's why the third principle of economic diplomacy is a global partnership narrative that we do to actually create the outreach. So media and the different modalities of media is definitely part of that. Because again, we're less than 9 years away from the 2030 agenda, and in order to mobilize more financing for delivering the SDGs, it is extremely important to have a compelling story and to show that your partnerships do deliver.
There's another question here from Sahar Shakir, who I think asked a very good question around how to allocate the budgets for the SDGs. So how did you prioritize, and on what basis, and what was the involvement of citizens in these decisions?
So of course, you know, Egypt went through a sort of an economic transformation, and one of the very important sectors that were important for the infrastructure sector. You wanted to be able to create more connectivity between cities. You wanted to create more and easy access for the private sector in terms of connectivity, new cities. Of course, making sure that sanitation, water, education, all of these were very important objectives. One of the ways of doing this, we have today the citizen budget, which is being discussed through the Ministry of Finance. So it creates a more overarching objective of where interventions should be. Of course, in this book, we look at something, one of the sources of finance, which is the ODA financing. It's not the full spending from the budget. And this is, again, an important point to underscore. And it's really through consultations with development partners, bankable projects, etc., that we are able to collect, you know, the buy-in to push forward through projects to deliver different SDGs.
Thank you. There's another question from a LSE student, Tru Jin Tao. He is asking, there must be countries and governments that doesn't have the capacity that Egypt has, and we thinking maybe of, you know, fragile states. And how do you think of multi-stakeholder coordination and platforms in those contexts?
I can go back a little bit in my career when I was an economist at the IMF, and we used to go on missions to countries where we, as you know, one of the big IFIs, providing platforms for coordination among the different stakeholders in those countries. What I can say is that the reason why we wanted to document what we did in a big country like Egypt, that has you know, access and that actually delivers on different projects, is to say that this is a template, this is a framework that can be replicated. You know, I think the international community today in light of the importance of multilateralism and solidarity, global solidarity, wants to help different countries. So there is a scope to create this type of platform in countries. Complementarity is important, trying to avoid redundancy when it comes to spending. The other thing is that, and it was also mentioned, every investment today has purpose as its as a key objective, and purpose comes through the different SDGs. So that is a motivation to be able to design projects that are targeted to certain SDGs. And then finally, which is very important, how do you advocate to domestic citizens and to the citizens of the countries, the bilaterals that are actually doing the financial allocation? So we tried here to create a framework that is not just unique to the country, which is Egypt, but it is actually, as Carmen mentioned, could be implemented by other countries because we operationalized it. It is not just theoretical, but actually multi-stakeholder platforms. These are, and Minouche mentioned the idea of aid effectiveness or harmonization, and this is truly happening when we sit all around the table, having greater transparency through the website. Each and every dollar that has come to the country in ODA is now quantified. You can see it, visually. You can come and visit these projects. The number of beneficiaries are mentioned explicitly, which goals are being targeted. So this is something that I think is not unique to Egypt. It's just a country case, but the framework is generally applicable elsewhere.
Thank you very much. We are coming close to the end of this, and I know that there are some videos that we want to show at the end. Maybe, Koyo, can you want me to conclude first before showing the videos? I think I should be concluding, but I think we have had a very good discussion, a very nice demonstration of the possibilities of individual countries taking ownership of their own development process and helping the international community to come together also and work together, manifest what it can deliver, and do so in a more effective and efficient way. And of course, bringing in also the private sector, bringing in civil society, all those things. You have provided a very good demonstration piece, and I'm sure it will be used by many. And we are very grateful that you have allowed LSE to be part of publishing this book, and that we can maybe have future opportunities to talk to you and talk to people who want to work along this approach, working to make the international system work better in countries that are developing and trying to implement the SDGs. So thank you very much, Dr. Rania, and we very much look forward to having contact with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Eric, and thank you, Minouche. Thank you, Carmen, for taking the time to go over the book. And as you mentioned, we look forward to engaging in the future as well. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, it is a pleasure to join this event hosted by the London School of Economics to launch an eye-opening new publication, Stakeholder Engagement Through Economic Diplomacy, by Dr. Al-Mashat. It comes at a moment of profound global upheaval, and we are just 10 years away from the ambitious target we set ourselves to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. This may seem like a short time, but I'm still hopeful for the future as more and more countries start to build forward better from this devastating global pandemic. However, countries working with the United Nations, with international financial institutions, with other multilateral stakeholders, with national and international private enterprises, and with civil societies cannot afford to lose any more time. Sustainable development must be undertaken collaboratively, efficiently, and urgently. And multilateral cooperation remains a vital instrument and complement to find shared solutions to global challenges. It is in this context that I would like to congratulate Dr. Al-Mashat and her co-author on the launch of this new book. It offers a detailed account of Egypt's journey to put in place multilateral, multidisciplinary platforms. Such multi-stakeholder platforms can support governments worldwide to strengthen the alignment of national development plans, budgets, and implementation systems with the SDGs. Indeed, financing the Sustainable Development Goals requires a closer examination of national operational and investment budgets, as well as further streamlining of official development assistance. And the entire private sector should use the SDGs as a lens to make new investments. At the United Nations Development Programme, we work closely with countries to implement integrated national financing frameworks, which are helping to accelerate SDG investments in more than now 70 countries. We have also encouraged the SDG mapping of national budgets, and UNDP has helped to develop pipelines of investments aligned with the goals through, for example, investor maps, as well as SDG impact standards for private equity funds, bonds, and enterprises. This work has supported the issuance of groundbreaking sovereign SDG bonds in several countries across the globe. The promise of the 2030 Agenda can only be realized through co-investment. Indeed, official development assistance remains central in providing direction and catalyzing investments while helping to leverage public and private investment from a wide variety of sources. Moreover, consider the pioneering work of the UNDP Accelerator Labs. Now supporting 115 countries, it is the world's largest and fastest learning network on sustainable development challenges. Surfacing and scaling up homegrown innovations with local communities, it is helping the United Nations to transition from project to portfolio approaches, which may be critical to brokering wider public-private collaborations that are also addressed in this book. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, I look forward to hearing more about the lessons learned from Egypt's unique experiences in this vein. And I expect that this pertinent new publication will prompt much needed discussion on how we can better leverage international cooperation to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, both far and wide, both globally and nationally. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, allow me to begin by thanking Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation of the Arab Republic of Egypt, for inviting me to participate in this event. I fully endorse the effort of Egypt to put together in this book called Stakeholder Engagement Through Economic Diplomacy the narrative that economic diplomacy and development cooperation must be pursued in a structured way. Excellencies, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the essential unity of humanity and the interdependence of nations, as well as the need to strengthen multilateral development cooperation. No country will be able to control the pandemic alone. If the majority of the population of the developing countries is not vaccinated, the virus will roam and return. All will be safe when everyone is safe. Similarly, global economic recovery will be difficult if the majority of the developing countries remain stagnant and in a state of recession. Multilateral cooperation and partnerships are therefore vital to promote global economic recovery. This is one of the major conclusions of the book. I agree with the assessment that an institutional, transparent, and inclusive country-led framework is important to facilitate constructive dialogue among all stakeholders involved in development cooperation. This has to be the UN Development Cooperation Framework's priority to reflect such a structured approach consistent with the priorities of the recipient countries. Excellencies, the 2030 Agenda and the corresponding SDGs provide the blueprint for the future of our development and the indispensable imperative to put people at the center of development cooperation and development strategies. Development cooperation and official development assistance, ODA, must be aligned with the SDGs. The SDG mapping of ODA is an important first step towards this objective. I am happy that Egypt has taken the lead on this. My own country has also initiated the SDG investor mapping to provide a framework for the future investments in sustainable development. However, I must emphasize that regardless of this mapping exercise, the developed countries must fulfill the 0.7% GNI target of ODA, and the ODA planned activities must be aligned with the host country's priorities. The most important conditions to promote these related goals of development cooperation is the availability of a pipeline of viable and bankable projects that contribute to development. Since infrastructure impacts on 92% of the SDGs, massive investments in sustainable infrastructure projects in developing countries are essential. Development cooperation partners should commit to strengthening the capacities of developing countries to formulate a pipeline of investable projects in sustainable infrastructure. As President of the Economic and Social Council, I have initiated discussions on sustainable infrastructure investment in developing countries with the participation of the private sector. I hope that this dialogue will lead to a structured approach towards investment in sustainable infrastructure in developing countries. I have asked for the transformation of the UN's SDG investment fair into a permanent mechanism and a multi-stakeholder dialogue to promote investment in sustainable infrastructure. Excellencies, development cooperation should support developing countries to build the capacity to transition to the emerging knowledge-based and technologically advanced world economy, to enter the new global supply chains, create new decent jobs, expand production and productivity. This implies rapid progress in digitalization and investing in digital infrastructure and skills. It implies greater access to advanced technologies and research and development, focused on objectives that can contribute to the sustainable development and to the climate goals. The multiple challenges we face, COVID-19, the implementation of the SDGs, and the climate crisis, are also an opportunity to build a better, more equitable, and more resilient global economic and social system. I am happy that this book will contribute to a successful transition to the new global and equitable economic system. I thank you.
So maybe it's finally, this was the acting Steiner, the head of the UNDP, and His Excellency Munir Akram, President of the Economic Social Council of the UN. So these were quite nice testimonies to your book, Dr. Rania. So please, good luck with sharing the message around the world. So thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.